so we're going to look at one of the most beautiful finishes to a seam, and that is the French seam. So the French seam is made up of two seam lines, one that's done on the outside and one that's done on the inside of the fabric. And what it does is it essentially encases all of the raw edges into one seam. So I've got a little example here, and you should be able to see that all those raw edges have been completely encased. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. So the first thing we're going to need to do, and it will feel really counterintuitive, is to turn our fabric and to align it wrong side to wrong side. Normally we do right side to right side, but in this case we're going to start off by pinning it wrong side to wrong side. And then what we need to do is do a little bit of calculation. So typically, if you're sewing a French seam, you will need to divide your total seam allowance into 3. So let's say, for example, we are running a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. What we're going to do is split it into 5mm chunks. So the first seam we're going to run is a 5mm seam down this edge, so it's quite close to the edge. And then what we'll do is we'll trim it and then we'll turn it, and then we'll run the remaining seam allowance, which will be 10mm. And what will happen is it will all look fabulous and beautiful and encased. So I'm going to go and do that now. Right, so I've now sort of placed my fabric, so the seam allowance is 5mm. I'm going to stitch that, as I've done with all my other stitches and my other seams, by placing the needle in, doing reverse, and I'm going to run a straight stitch at 2.5mm length all the way down. Lovely, and there we go. So one of the most important things to do after you've done your first line of stitching is to trim off this excess. If you don't, then there's a real danger of you, when you turn this over to the wrong side, there's a real danger of you trapping in those extra raw edge and whiskers from the fraying. It just really elevates your stitching. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this down probably to about 2 or 3mm, just to make sure that I have no excess peeking out. So I'll go and do that now. So this has now been trimmed, so I'm going to just press this closed, so I've got all the seam allowances going in the same direction, but I'm applying some heat just to relax that fabric, and then I'm going to fold it over and press it again so the seams are all together. And because I did 5mm on the first seam, I will do 10mm on this second seam. Okay, now if you wanted to, you can pin this into position, although I have to say at this point it's feeling pretty solid, so pinning might not be necessary. But I'm just going to run a couple of pins in there, and then I will sew it at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Right, so I've now placed this in at 1 centimetre seam allowance, or 10mm, and you can see how that seam has been encased. That first seam is all sort of tucked in. So I'm going to place my needle into the fabric, run a couple of reverse stitches, and stitch that all the way down. There we go. Here we are. So the only thing we've got to do now is to press it out. So I do think this is one of the most beautiful ways to finish off a seam. You don't just have to do it on straight edges, you can do it on things like sleeves. You can finish off the inside of an armhole really beautifully using a French seam method. The only thing you've got to be mindful about is that you can't do it on very heavy fabric because it's just too much and it will bulk and it will take away from its beauty. So now I'm just going to press this into position, and I'm going to press it to one side because you can't press it over both. You can't press it open. You can choose one side or the other. It doesn't really matter. What you shouldn't do is have one I don't know, a hem finish there and a waistband finish there and it be twisted in the middle, because that won't look pretty. So you need to kind of pick a side and commit to it. But if you give that a press and then fold that over, that is just the most beautiful seam. And there we go.